Ողջույն։ Ինչպես տեղյակ եք, Հայաստանում տեղի են ունեցել իշխանափոխություն եւ որոշ այլ փոփոխություններ քաղաքական ասպարեզում։ Այս զարգացումները գրավել են ոչ միայն հայկական սփյուռքի ուշադրությունը, այլ նույնիսկ աշխարհի մամուլի հետաքրքրությունը։ Այսօր հայագիտական ուսման ծրագիրը Լոնդոնից ուղիղ եթերով ձեզ է ներկայացնում բաց քննարկում Հայաստանի վերջին իրադարձությունների եւ զարգացումների շուրջ։ Քննարկմանը մասնակցելու են սփյուռքի հայ փորձագետներ, ամեն մեկն ունենալու է կարճ ելույթ եւ հետո հնարավորություն ենք տալու լսարանին եւ ուղիղ եթերով մեզ հետևողներին ուղղել իրենց հարցերը մեզ։ Ամբողջ քննարկումը տեղի է ունենալու անգլերենով, իսկ ելույթներից հետո ձեր հարցերը կարող եք կազմել նաեւ հայերենով։ Now let's switch to English. The whole discussion will be taking place in English. That was a short introductory statement in Armenian. And I'm going to give a very short overview of what's been happening in Armenia over the past month or so, just so that our viewers and the audience can think of the subject in terms of its context, and for those of you who don't know about what's been happening, so I can give some of this context anew. The main issue has been the resignation of Serzh Sargsyan, which occurred exactly a month ago today. He was a kind of symbol of the political system that has been in place in Armenia for more or less the past 20 years or so. And he was the target of the protests that started in Armenia around mid-April. But as I said, he was simply a symbol, and the people who went out to protest wanted change for the whole system within the country. The issues that people were discontent with were widespread corruption in various fields, in the justice system, in the educational system, in the political system. There was economic degradation in the country, a gradual economic degradation that has been sort of going on since the Karabakh War and after that. But in fact, despite people talking about a dictatorship, the government control of dissidents in the country was not actually that sophisticated. There was still room for people to voice their opinions. There was still a fairly open media for people to discuss the problems that Armenia faced in a widespread arena. And so the protests have a sort of tradition in Armenia that may sort of go back to the grassroots movements of the Karabakh movement in 1988. And after the war, Levon Ter-Petrosyan took the presidency. He was then replaced by Robert Kocharyan in 1998 after his resignation. Serzh Sargsyan came to power in 2008. And in 2008 began the sort of rebirth of the culture of protesting at a grassroots level. Widespread protests broke out in 2008 in March, during which a few number of people were actually killed. And this sort of started a chain of protesting culture that continued in Armenia till very recently. The protests then continued in Serzh Sargsyan's re-election in 2013. There were more demonstrations in 2015 during the energy price hikes. This was dubbed the Electric Yerevan. Then in 2016, just one day after the attempted coup in Turkey, was the capturing of the police station in Yerevan by Sasnatserer, called the Daredevils of Sasun in English. And so this is the context that we will be speaking about, the protests that have been happening in Armenia. After his resignation, elections took place on May the 1st, Nikol Pashinyan, the leader of the opposition and the leader of the Yelk coalition, was not elected. Elections then took place again on May the 8th, when he was elected as Prime Minister of the Republic of Armenia. Straight after his election as Prime Minister, he visited Shushi in Artsakh, Qarabakh, which for many people was very telling. He wanted to sort of reassert the claim that he is thinking of the security issues as a priority in Armenia, and so his visit to Shushi was, of course, very symbolic of that. And he expressed the sort of traditional hardline stance on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, in which he said that negotiations will not take place unless Azerbaijan recognizes the sovereignty of the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, and if Nagorno-Karabakh Republic can participate in negotiations. Straight after his election, what was quite telling was that one of the first countries to recognize him in the post of Prime Minister was Russia, when Maria Zakharova, the spokeswoman of the Russian Foreign Ministry, congratulated him. This then was followed by a number of other countries, including Turkey, when Binali Yildirim congratulated Nikol Pashinyan, and he said that he was happy to know that Nikol Pashinyan did not have any preconditions for establishing relations with Turkey, and that Armenia had sort of not put any sort of extreme conditions, in his view, for the reconciliation of political relations between Armenia and Turkey. So after that, Nikol Pashinyan, he created the new cabinet. As you probably all know, that a lot of the new faces are very young. Sort of part of this is his strategy to clear Armenia of the sort of post-Soviet legacy and bring in fresh minds, many of them who have studied in Western educational institutions. And among these, there, as we will be discussing the diaspora, the new Minister of the Diaspora, Mukhtar Harapetyan, is very young, I think 28. And actually today I heard on the news that he has appointed as an assistant a Syrian Armenian, very young, quite young girl, which I think is the first to have a diasporan Armenian in the sort of working with the Armenian cabinet. And then another geopolitical issue is the Eurasian Economic Customs Union. Nikol Pashinyan went to Sochi on May the 14th to have a meeting with Vladimir Putin and all the other members of the Eurasian Economic Union, in which he stated that he will not diverge from the already established foreign policy of the Republic of Armenia. In Armenia itself, some protests are still continuing. The main ones include protests against the mayor of Yerevan, Taron Margaryan, and others include the protests in Amusar and a number of other protests organized by environmentalists actually throughout Armenia with regards to the exploitation of resources and the mines and the workers at the mines. Although Nikol Pashinyan has for now said that people should discontinue the protests so that the government can stabilize. So this is the context in which we will be speaking today about a number of different issues, and each panelist will bring forth their perspective on the recent events in Armenia. Now I'd like to introduce you to all the panelists. We have Dr. Armine Ishkhanyan, She is currently Associate Professor and the Programme Director of the MSc in Social Policy and Development at the London School of Economics, LSE. To her right is Dr. Serzh Sargsyan, a sociologist and associate faculty member of Oxford University's Oriental Institute. And next to me is Dr. Serzh Sargsyan, who is currently Associate Professor of History at the University of Michigan and Director of the Armenian Research Center. I would like to close my speech now and hand over the podium to Dr. Armine Ishkhanyan. Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. Thank you for the introduction. I'm just going to show a few slides because I want to use some photos. I've put this up here because exactly a year ago, almost to the day, May 18, 2017, I gave a lecture at this university, and it was called Armenia After Transition, What Prospects for Social Justice and Democracy. And when I gave that lecture, people were very depressed. There was no sense that anything was going to change. I see several people who were here that day. And it's astonishing that a year later, less than a year later, how much has changed. So I think in a sense, you know, it's quite, we need to record that we didn't expect it. It was unexpected. It was very rapid. And for that reason, I think we need to think about where we're going. So, can we have the next slide? So as Leon already said, and I'm not going to spend too much time on the context because he gave a very good introduction, but I did want to put up these images for a few reasons. First, to indicate that this movement is not new. It grew out of a particular context. Leon mentioned 1988, the Karabakh movement, March 1st. But Terut, the movement around the Terut mine, began in 2007. And there were consistently large-scale or small-scale movements throughout this past decade. But in addition to there being movements, if you look at the pictures, and I didn't select them on a gender bias, I just wanted to put that out, there are a lot of women in those pictures. There are a lot of women, civil society, active in civil society. And I think, you know, when we look at what has happened in terms of who's been appointed to government, that isn't reflected necessarily in terms of who was leading the fight. And I've heard different kinds of arguments that some women were invited and they didn't participate, fine. But I think we have to be more inclusive as a society. We're 50% after all, women are. Also, young people. And I'm glad Leon mentioned that the Minister of Diaspora is quite young. And I think this is definitely, what happened in Armenia would not have happened without the young people. It wouldn't have happened if you didn't have the independence generation who hadn't grown up in the Soviet past, who didn't have the fear that some of their parents and grandparents had. So I think in that sense, that's also very important to recognize that young people, women were involved. But it's also very important to ask what was different this time, because people were angry around social issues. People were angry at the government not listening to them. I think what was different this time around were a few things. Number one was that it wasn't just civil society. You had a political party, you had a politician who was leading. And so you could see where this could go, where this could develop. It wasn't just about, you know, civil society protesting. It was about a political leader willing to take it to the next level in terms of political leadership and changing the regime. I think, second, there was a tipping point. All of these protests over the past few years have been building and building. The anger and the lack of response has been growing. And so this was a tipping point. And the third, I think it's, you know, we talk about dates and we think about the coincidence that this, you know, April 24th was a key also event in terms of this revolution, because Serzh Sargsyan resigned right before. Why? You know, there was that sense that he didn't want to destabilize the country. And I think we need to look at all of these things to understand what was happening. But I think most importantly was what happened was there was a moment where as Václav Havel, a Czech dissident and then later the president of the Czech Republic, said, during communist times, people got used to living in the lie. And once they realized that they have power, they began to live in the truth. So they began to challenge the regime. And the regime very quickly collapsed because it wasn't built as strongly as people had thought. And I think that's what we saw in Armenia, that day after day, it might have started with the young activists, it might have started with a small select group of Pashinyan supporters, but pretty soon it was pretty much everyone in society. So that led to also that tipping point which I mentioned. And when I say people were angry at government inaction, I think, Raphael, nothing captures it better than this image. For those of you who don't read Armenian, that pretty much says, Ya irok? Well, really? Or you don't say? I think that image and those words, and that's a direct quote from former President, former Prime Minister Serzh Sargsyan, that, so what? You know, you're just going to protest and go home. And I think that was also kind of this response that had been going on, the tone-deaf, unresponsive. We can act with impunity. No one is going to challenge our power. That was very strong, but as we saw, it collapsed very quickly. So now I want to move to looking ahead. So where to from here? And because I teach in a Department of Social Policy and I direct a master's in international social and public policy, I want to bring it to the discussion in terms of thinking around this issue, around social and public policy, but also to draw on international experience, what we can learn and how that can help us in thinking about the future. So I've put together this slide in which I've broken down several of my ideas in terms of thinking around social and public policy. I would argue that what we need, instead of wholesale copy-pasting from other countries, is to think about an Armenian model of development. What will that mean? And people need to be involved in that conversation. Experts, citizens, so forth. And I'm calling it the sustainable, just, and inclusive development model. It needs to be sustainable, so it can't be solely based on let's mine the entire country and cut down every single forest. It needs to be just, because a lot of the protests were around social justice issues, and it needs to be inclusive of all segments of society. In terms of public and social policy, we need to think about the political dimensions, the socio-economic dimensions as well. From the political perspective, the most important, and Prime Minister Pashinyan has already started working in this direction, is rule of law. Armenia has not been ruled with a rule of law-based system. And I think it was very important that he said, we're not going to ring the judges and tell them what they need to do. The judges need to do their job and make the decisions without getting the phone call from Bahramian 26. Rule of law means everyone, every citizen is equal in front of the law. The second is about responsive and inclusive institutions. The era of Ya irok needs to be over well and truly. Public servants are public servants. They are paid through the taxes of citizens. They need to respond. So when citizens say, why are the prices of food going up right before Christmas and New Year's, instead of saying go eat some potatoes, as several parliamentarians did, they need to recognize that they have been elected to deal with the issues of people's livelihoods and well-being. And the third point around political dimensions is about tackling grand and petty corruption in Armenia. By grand corruption, I mean, the huge sources of funding, the loans that are coming and then disappearing. There's a joke in development. It says, come to my house, I'm going to show you something. And he comes to his house and he says, do you see that bridge? And he says, no, I don't see the bridge. He's like, well, look, I spent the money on my house, not on the bridge. That's not an Armenian joke, by the way. It applies across developing countries. But then there's the petty corruption of you're driving down the road, you get stopped, you put the 1000 dram or maybe 5000 dram in your passport, don't give me a parking violation, or the traffic violation. Those are those were common practices in Armenia. And I think to move forward, those need to be tackled. And again, those issues are being tackled in different spheres across the public sector, including in education, in health, and so forth. So I think this is very important. The second big dimension is around socioeconomic factors. I think in terms of developing an Armenian model, we need to move beyond extractivism, which I already mentioned. Extractivism is a term used in development studies to talk about mining practices or oil and gas, which is about taking things from the earth and profiting from them. But I think we can also think about extractivism as a metaphor in terms of how that was the policy. It was as if Armenia was a fire sale. We're going to sell off key industries. We're going to sell off, different things. And I think this is something where we need a mentality shift, a different way of thinking, beyond extractivism, beyond a politics and a development model based on just selling things off or selling off concessions. And this is why I've put in Amulsar, because this is the big mine project, which, as Leon mentioned, is being discussed. There's protests around it, and I think this is going to be a very important issue in coming months and weeks. And so it's important to see how that will be resolved. And I do recognize yesterday, from the Prime Minister's live stream, that it is an issue that he's concerned with around mining and so forth, but how he will be able to deal with it isn't solely based on what's happening in Armenia, because there's international courts that may or may not rule in particular way. So I think that's important to keep in mind. But more positively, if we're not doing extractivism, what are we doing? Again, in his speech, he talked about 3 areas of development. One was tourism, one was agricultural development, and the other was the IT sector. And I think if Armenia is going to keep pace with the modern global economy, it needs to reverse the brain drain, and it needs to attract and keep talent in the country, not drive people away. So I think, there is a huge potential for IT development, for technological development, modern banking practices, and so forth. So there is that potential, but as linked to my first point around rule of law, that needs to come if people are going to invest and feel that their money is safe in the country. And last but not least, we often talk about and we hear about economic growth. What is economic growth for? There was over 7% economic growth in 2017 in Armenia, and yet 1/3 of the population, over 30% of the population, continue to live in dire poverty. How can we translate economic growth into a better life for Armenians so people do not leave the country? And I think one of the key areas that requires government intervention alongside civil society as well as market intervention is to invest in social development. And I would argue what we need is a rights-based model of development and not a charity model. Oh, let's help the poor because we're such nice people. That doesn't work. As Armenians showed, they want dignity, they want social justice, they do not want handouts. So this should not be an afterthought, it should not be charity, it should be about how we can invest. Everyone cannot be an entrepreneur. You're not going to have a 90-year-old entrepreneur. There will be children who are poor. There will be parents with lots of children who cannot, necessarily make it in the market. So I think we need to take that into consideration. And finally, to conclude, this decade began when Mohamed Bouazizi set himself alight in Tunisia because the government wasn't listening, because of poverty, because of a lack of dignity. The protests in Tunisia set the spark for the Arab Spring, for the global Occupy movement, and many other movements, including in Hayastan. Now, the image I have put up here is from Tunisia from a few months ago in 2018. People are back out into the streets. People are angry because the promises of freedom, bread, and dignity have not been realized. And almost 7 years have passed. People waited. So what I'm trying to say is that these are problems that don't happen, they don't have quick solutions, they don't happen overnight. But if things do not change, you are going to see people coming back to the streets because they've seen that works to a certain extent. So that was one. The other international example that I've chosen to put up here is Greece and the Troika being the European Central Bank, the IMF, and the European Union. And why I have put that up there, because in 2016, when the Greek people went to the polls at a referendum, they said, we do not want austerity. They elected Syriza to end the austerity regime. But what happened? Austerity continued. Because, and this is very important for Armenia, one country does not always decide what happens. Armenia is part of the global order. International organizations such as the World Bank, such as the IMF, are going to have an impact. The mining sector in Armenia wasn't developed just by Armenian oligarchs. It was developed by the support and the encouragement of the World Bank, for instance. So I think we need to keep that in mind, to recognize that problems will not be overcome in matter of days or months. We need to be patient, but we also need to recognize that change must come, or else the stability, instability, volatility may not settle down. Thank you.
Now we move on to Dr. Raj Chilingirian.
Thank you, Leon. I want to share with you some thoughts and some reflection about the diaspora and the diaspora's response to the recent events and the revolution in Armenia. Now, a lot of times when we speak about the diaspora, it is not clear in everyone's mind what do we mean when we say diaspora. Obviously, the diaspora is not a monolithic entity like a state. You have Armenia and then you have the diaspora. It doesn't work like that. As we all know through experience and knowledge, the diaspora is a collection of communities spread around the world. So this is very important to keep in mind, that we're not comparing two states or two entities that are equal in terms of their makeup. So within the diaspora, we have what's known as the classical diaspora, Tasagan Spürk, which is made of mostly the descendants of the survivors of the genocide in the Ottoman Empire. And in more recent years, since Armenia's independence especially, we have the diaspora of the Republic of Armenia over the last 30 years or so that have spread around the world. So we have what's known as the Hayastanti, or the Armenia Hayastan diaspora, and we have the classical, the traditional Armenian diaspora spread around the world. The second thing to bear in mind is that when we talk about the diaspora, actually we have to realize that 80% of the diaspora is in 4 countries. Even though there are Armenians in some 100 countries or more than 100 countries, but 80% is in Russia, the US, France, and Georgia. So this is also important because when we are discussing about the specifics of the diaspora, about the resources of the diaspora, about the local cultural and political and economic aspects of the diaspora, it's important to define which diaspora or which part of the diaspora we are speaking about. And then the other important point is that obviously the diaspora has institutions and organizations, and it's also made of individuals who do not belong to any of the organizations in the diaspora. So many times when we speak about the diaspora, especially in the discourse in Armenia, actually in effect we are talking about 7 organizations in the diaspora which are transnational. That is the 3 churches, Apostolic, Catholic, and Protestant Evangelical Armenian Church, and the 3 political parties, ARF, Hanchak, and Ramgavar Party, and the AGBU. So these 7 organizations are transnational and have branches throughout the diaspora. However, of course, there are organizations, local organizations, whether here in Britain or in America, that are local in nature, but not necessarily transnational in their existence. So many at times, on the official level, at least on the Armenian government level, the engagement with the diaspora has been primarily through these 7 organizations and their sub groups and sub entities. So, as such, the institutions and the organizations that I mentioned, the transnational organizations in the diaspora, they have been silent during the entire period of the revolution. Nothing was said, no support or no critique. They were just silent about the situation and the unfolding saga in Armenia. However, we had individuals who were very active, who became very active. There were local protests through individual initiatives. And again, if we take the celebrities, Serzh Sargsyan and others, who in a way represented the diaspora at the revolution, but they represented no organization but themselves. So again, the real engagement with the popular movement was on the individual level and not the organizational level. Now, the organizations, obviously, if we take the church throughout Armenia's independence, as well as the other, if we take the 7 organizations as a group, they have primarily been what we could call pro-government. They've had pro-government position for a variety of reasons, subjective or objective reasons. And they have never engaged with civil society or with the issues of injustice, other than humanitarian assistance, helping the villagers or in education, and whatnot in terms of investments. When it came to the real societal issues of injustice, inequality, human rights, democracy, development, and so on, the diaspora organizations had generally remained silent and non-engaged, considering that their position is, or they've argued that we have to preserve the Armenian statehood, preserve the country, so we cannot be critical about the governance issues. And this has been a major problem for years. However, during and after the revolution, the Velvet Revolution, this has come out again into the public, and within the diaspora community, it started to be discussed. And as a matter of fact, in some organizations, there are already dissident voices that are becoming critical about it. Now, as such, in the diaspora, one of the other fundamental problems has been that there are many leaders of organizations and their subgroups, a lot of leaders, but no leadership when it comes to national issues, policy making, whether within the diaspora communities or vis-a-vis Armenia. So as such, we've had many directions, many ideas, many projects based on the particular agenda of the organizations that I mentioned in the 7. For instance, as far as the church in the diaspora, the church has been directly under the influence of the mother church in Armenia. So whatever the position had been of the mother church, it has been trickled down, or it has been adopted as the position of the dioceses or the churches in the diaspora. So that's why the church has never complained or defended, injustice, whether in the diaspora, to talk about it, or in Armenia. So it has been, so the connection with the church in Armenia and the diaspora has been very influential. Same thing to a large extent with the political parties. There have been, especially those parties, the ARF, for instance, Dashnaksutun, that had over the years been part of the coalition government. So obviously, because of their position, they have also influenced their party branches in the diaspora. Now, in terms of, for instance, AGBU and other charitable organizations, now AGBU is one of the largest, if not the largest organization. Throughout the Armenia's independence, and again we see it now, they have restricted or they've confined their engagement within the humanitarian assistance framework of engagement with Armenia. But again, nothing in terms of governance issues, nothing in terms of the very people that they are helping are affected by the policies that are being made by the government that they are supporting. So they have never seen these organizations, the connection that on the one hand, the hand you're shaking is the same hand that's repressing or it's causing the poverty for which you are being asked to help. So this is something now the diaspora has to realize, because now the space has been opened for dialogue and a serious discussion about these issues. The other aspect that had been and is to some extent problematic for the diaspora is that successive Armenian governments have tried, attempted, or had intentions of organizing the diaspora to their own image and liking, so to speak. So whatever the Armenian government's engagement has been defined by this desire to organize the diaspora in such a way that it would suit its own outlook, expectations, and its vision for the diaspora. And this was done to some extent through the creation of Ministry of Diaspora and other, whether investment programs and so on and so forth. So this is still a problem, whether the diaspora has to think in terms of diaspora-centered view of Armenia or Armenia-centered view of the diaspora, and perhaps somewhere in between. For instance, recently, last week, Vazgen Manukyan, who is now the president of the Public Council, Hanrain Khorud, he suggested that there should be Hamashkharain Haygagan Garuit. There should be an international Armenian structure that will bring together the Armenian nation, Armenia, diaspora, and Artsakh together. And finally, the point that I want to make, Nikol Pashinyan and his government, they have indicated a particular focus or policy or view of the diaspora, and that's Hayrena Tartsutun, repatriation or immigration in a lot of cases. And this obviously has very practical implications in terms of the declining population of Armenia, economic development, and so on and so forth. And primarily the focus seems to be obviously the Armenians, repatriation in the real sense, meaning that those who left Armenia in the last 27 years or so to help them or to create opportunities for these people to come back. And then on the second tier or on the second understanding is obviously the classical diaspora or members of the classical diaspora would also think perhaps about going back and helping Armenia. And Nikol Pashinyan has also made some statements about the diaspora. For instance, he mentioned about the problem of utilizing the resources, human resources of the diaspora, especially because of the current constitution. For instance, a minister has to have been lived in Armenia for at least 4 years, and he or she has to be a citizen of Armenia. So this is a restriction on, let's say, if there are experts or qualified people who could run a ministry, it would prevent them from taking office. So he was suggesting that down the road, the constitution or the laws have to be changed to reflect the real realities and the ways, the more efficient ways of using the diaspora's resources. Not only financial, but the emphasis on the human resources. And my final point is that I believe that this revolution has already had an influence, an effect on the diaspora. I don't think the diaspora will continue to operate the same old ways as it has always been. There is a need, especially by the individuals that I mentioned, people who are not part of the organizations in the membership. There is a desire, a demand, an expectation that the diaspora itself has to reform and change in order to bring its own local and regional capacities, and resources, and capabilities up to the standards of the 21st century, both for the preservation of Armenian culture and identity, which is an issue for the diaspora, as well as for a better and more efficient and valuable engagement with Armenia. Thank you.
Well, I'll try to keep it short because I know we're running out of time. Today I will try to do something for which I have not been trained. As a historian, I have to look back, but I'm trying to predict what may happen in the coming weeks and months. Again, comparing the situation in Armenia today with some of the other important revolutions that I know and teach about in history. Revolutions are usually prolonged affairs. We commemorate them once a year, like July the 14th or July the 4th or whatever, but we have to always keep in mind that the French Revolution did not end on July the 4th, it just started. And the same was true with July the 4th in America in 1776. And so we have to expect months, if not years, of political instability, to use a mild word, yeah, and lack of clarity to see in the end who wins. And there is no way that we can predict who will win at this stage. This has been, to some extent, a strange revolution, and it's also strange, constrained by the international field. Had this revolution happened in 1950s or 60s, a period I wrote about, the Foreign Office would never have asked for democracy. They would have said, do you have control of your country? Then we'll recognize you. Those things have changed and put us in a very difficult situation where a revolutionary regime has to work according to a constitution tailor-made by the previous regime to sustain itself, I don't know, eternally, with no plans to give away power to anybody else, with a parliament which was elected with a lot of pressure exercised on voters, from physical to threats to dismiss people from work, and to some extent also vote buying. But I will always put the vote buying at the least of these levels. We should not really talk much about it. And then this revolutionary regime, which prior to the revolution consisted of only 4 members in the parliament of 105, now has to function as a majority supported by the popular vote, at least through the mass rallies that have taken place, against a rigged constitutional parliamentary majority in parliament, who would say we were elected last year, and technically the way they were elected is no longer being questioned. This really has put a lot of pressure on this transition period, and it has affected, I think, the formation of the cabinet. Technically, the cabinet is something like a coalition between 3 parties. The Civic Accord, which was the party of Pashinyan, was only one of the 3 members of the YELK, or Way Out coalition. And out of the 7 members they had in parliament, as far as I know, 9 members they had, only 4 of them were from the Civic Accord. The other 5 were from the other 2 parties. Add to them a party called Prosperous Armenia, which is basically centered around an oligarch who is quasi-opposition, yeah? And add to it the Armenian Revolutionary Federation Tashnak Party, who was an ally of the government and only changed side, if I may use the term, in the 13th hour, not the 11th one. So technically, although Pashinyan needs every single vote of these, and basically these parties, I'm talking about Prosperous Armenia and the Tashnak, know that they have less to lose from this change rather than the ruling Republican Party. So one of the, and we don't know whether this government will stay for a short period of time. That's the stated aim. They say we will hold elections. And the last I heard, elections before the end of this year. I still do not know if legally that will be possible as well, because the election law has to be changed. And I don't know how much you can change the election law without touching upon the Constitution. I'm still waiting for, lawyers to show a way out of this crisis. But even in the last past 15 days, we see that it's only the ministers who are in the Civic Accord section of the government who are coming up with lots of ideas to change. The other ministries are basically silent. And we never hear anything from the ministers representing Prosperous Armenia or the ARF about what they are planning to do. Although they are very broadly said, we are going to do fundamental changes, and they have 2 very important ministries, the economy and also the environment. But basically their ministers have, agriculture. Their ministers have been relatively silent on this. So that also is to some extent problematic about how this government will function now that it has to produce a common program, go to parliament, where technically the opposition majority has to vote for it to basically the government to become effective. So ultimately, I wish I could have just talked to the leaders of the UN and say, forget about this election, just let's scrap this parliament and start from scratch. That would have been much easier. This kind of artificially maintaining this constitutional facade will be very problematic. But it seems that Armenia as a small country has no way out. And there's no pun on words here. The important other thing is that people expected, including my friends in the media in Armenia, that the Republican Party will not survive the resignation or death of Serzh Sargsyan. A good friend of mine used to say, once Serge is out of power, I can pack all the remaining members of the Republican Party on a single bus. And this was it. But ultimately, in the past month, there has only been 2 or 3 defections from the party, and still it has a majority. Now, will it be able to sustain itself without the patronage and all the other levers of power that it had in the coming 5 to 6 months? We really do not know. But it's a very interesting thing. People expected that to happen because during the previous change of government, the meaningful change of government, which happened in Armenia in 1998, basically Bedrosian was forced to resign because many of of deputies in his own bloc defected to a dissident defense minister. And basically people expected that to return. It's always better to be wiser than the event, and since I'm coming from America, to be a Monday morning quarterback, as we like to say there, is that why did it happen this time? Now it's easy, always historians, it's easier after things happen, you come up with the logical explanation, never predicting beforehand, is that at that time there was no class issue involved. It was the same elite disagreeing on how to solve the Karabakh issue, and that really caused the schism within the ruling elite. Nobody was afraid that it will lose his wealth or his family's wealth. Now, if this revolution goes to its logical conclusion, it will really become a social revolution. We do not have a long history of social domination by these oligarchs, but the oligarchs are a new class, a post-Soviet class, and the aim of this revolution is to undermine their rule, at least their political rule, if not to basically take back many of things what people in Armenia think that they have looted over the years. So this is why it has really made it a much more cohesive force trying to defend its ground against a much more dangerous threat than was the case in 1998. When will elections take place? We don't know. What kind of new majority will come out? What kind of political parties will contest? And does the ruling group around Pashinyan will still be in a commanding position if those elections are free and fair? We really do not know. But ultimately, it seems that those who want radical change will coalesce around this group, and so they will try to wage an electoral campaign in order to preserve and then deepen what they think they have achieved. Of course, the Republicans will be very conservative, and we really do not know where prosperous Armenia will stand, because I don't think they will be as radical on these issues. Like, for example, some of the suggestions in the field of education that I have been very excited. I have also been excited by the appointments, knowing the work of some of the ministers, or especially the deputy ministers, as university professors, of what they do in their classrooms, etc. I have been very excited. But I don't think that everybody who opposed Serzh Sargsyan shares those agendas. There are lots of conservative people who dislike the Republicans, but they will necessarily not subscribe to a radical reformist agenda, a pro-European agenda, or at least European in the classical sense that the Armenians understand it. In the end, Armenia still is too much under the influence of, Russian way of thinking, because the Russians control, to a large extent, what Armenians listen to and watch on TV and on radio and other things. So all these things are important. And definitely, among those groups who work together to bring Serzh Sargsyan down, there will be competition among them on ideological grounds during the next election. A couple of years back, Armenia wrote a very interesting article about contrasting the 2015 revolt with the 2016 revolt. That the first one was more like the recent one, in the sense that it has a very, what we will call a progressive agenda, while the one by Sasnat Zarer, when that group which basically occupied that police station, it was a radical nationalist but socially conservative agenda. And these people are part of Armenian society. They will get organized. They will have the right to contest the elections. So those people who think that everything will be perfect from looking for a European prism will not necessarily turn into actual democratic politics. So these are some of the things that will happen in the coming months and years, and we'll have to see and always be wiser after the event in trying to analyze them without having able to predict them in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists for their presentations. We've covered a variety of topics so far. Armenia touched upon the sort of international setting in which the protest took place and the social society activities within Armenia. Harash Chilingirian focused on the developing relationship between the Republic of Armenia and the Armenian diaspora. And Arasanjan focused on the constitutional changes that might occur and the new political regime that might come out of these past few weeks of changes. So now I'm going to open up the discussion to our audience, both here in London and for those of you watching at home and are already sending in your questions. I'm going to start with the questions that I've got online now. I already have 3 questions. They're all quite general, and any one of the panelists can choose to answer them, and anyone who wishes to address their questions can choose to address them to a particular member of the panelists or to all of them, and they can choose which question to answer. The 3 questions I've got online, as I said, they're quite general, but any of you can choose how to answer them. I have a question from Jairo Hakopian. He is asking about the panelists' thoughts on the political prisoners in the country. As we know, there are a few political prisoners who are still in jail at this moment, most notably members of the Sasnatserer, and recently Giray Sefilyan and Varujan Avetisyan wrote a letter to Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan saying that the situation would be quite dangerous if he were to keep the political prisoners in jail. And so one of the panelists, please answer what they think about the situation with the political prisoners. Another question from M. Safarian would like to know the panelists' views on the newly appointed cabinet members in terms of their involvement in shaping a new Armenia. And we have a question from Fatima Mehdieva, who would like to know what the change in government in Yerevan, how it will affect the situation with the Nagorno-Karabakh issue. The question about the political prisoners, who would like to answer?
Well, I don't have much to add except what the government has said, that essentially, yet again, these people have been jailed according to the procedures in place at the time. We know by judges who take their orders from the executive. Now, there are different levels of these people. Some who are the trials were progressing are being left out on bail. So basically, they are no longer being kept in custody as the trials are going. In one case, I think the appeal hasn't taken place, so I expect the appeal just to quash the earlier verdict. And the other side, the only issue is the issue of Sasnatserer. The problem is that I think 2 or 3 policemen were killed during the takeover, and how to handle with that legally. And I really don't know how that will be handled legally. But also, in the case of Sasnatserer and Nikol Pashinyan, there is no love lost. Going back to 2016, and they willingly or unwillingly see one another as rivals and do not trust one another that much. I would not talk about the whole history of this, but the history goes back to 2006, and it continued during the recent demonstrations, and I'm sure that will also play a role. Ultimately, of course, enough members of the Sasnatserer should be out before the elections so that they can organize themselves as a party and compete. And if the government delays that or brings the elections very hastily forward just to make it difficult for them to organize, it will be used against it as having used the levers of power in order to keep out an opponent. And in Armenian history modern, we have had a number of instances where people were kept out of power, like diaspora Armenians not given citizenship, although they live in Armenia for years, in order to prevent them from running, while somebody like my next door neighbor in Antilyas in Lebanon, who may not have visited Armenia in his or her own life, may still get a passport by just going to the nearest Armenian embassy and never visiting Armenia. So these were the two extreme cases. So we have to be very, very careful. And the regime, civic accord that is, in order to leave a good image, has to be very careful that it is being watched at its every step. So I think that's the dilemma.
What do we think of the appointed members of the cabinet?
That's a loaded question, because what do we judge them on? Their age, their looks, their what? We need to judge them on their actions, and I prefer not to judge people until we've given them a chance to act. So let's wait on that, and I'll be happy to answer that person's question in a few months.
Okay, and Safarian will send you an
thing?
email. Yes, please.
I think that the reason why we ended up with a very young cabinet is because the way people were not ready to believe in what Pashinyan was doing. And in the end, he ended up with a very young party and basically brought in the people he knew into power, where almost everybody around him were telling him, you will fail, don't do it, you will fail, don't do it. So that kind of circumstantial composition of the cabinet has to be taken. How they do judge, well, I really want to see them.
Exactly, yeah.
People he can trust. Another, of course, loaded question. I think
in terms of Karabakh, the Karabakh conflict, I believe, or I want to be hopeful, that there might be a positive development, in the sense that for nearly 20 years, nothing has really moved forward. It's been like a vicious cycle in terms of the negotiations. But now, obviously, the new government's, or at least Nikol Pashinyan's, position has been that the Armenians of Karabakh, who are the main subject of this conflict between Azerbaijan and the Armenians of Karabakh, should take part in the negotiations, in the process, because this is very much something that will affect the Karabakh Armenians. So far, obviously, it's been more or less a bilateral process between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and that hasn't worked. So perhaps this is an opportunity for the sides to turn the page and go back, because originally, until Robert Kocharian became president, it was a three-way negotiation. So perhaps now they can say that the bilateral framework hasn't worked. Let's give it a chance by involving again the authorities in Karabakh, because Karabakh has gone quite a long way in the last 25 years in terms of governance, in terms of its internal dynamics and so on. It's not what it was 25 years ago. So that has to be also taken into consideration. So it will depend on how the leadership that are involved in this conflict would regard the opportunity or see it as a hindrance to move forward.
Okay, thank you. Now, do we have any questions from the audience? Please.
I'll ask a difficult question to Armenia. None of you mentioned transitional justice, and Pashinyan has actually stated that he's not going to prosecute or persecute the former regime. Whereas in revolutionary changes, there is often a decision, a political decision, to what degree you're going to go after the ancient regime who has stolen whatever. So I would like to hear your views on that, and how does Armenian society, Armenian civil society, perceive the transitional justice issue? Because that also sends a signal to the oligarchs, right?
Do you want me to
One
answer?
by one, let's...
Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks, Razmik. That's a very good question. If we're thinking of transitional justice, we need to divide between restorative justice and retributive justice. So one is about punishing and one is about acknowledging and moving forward. I think the good or the best example to my mind is the example of South Africa after apartheid in terms of creating the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where there was an opportunity to talk about and people to accept what had happened, and for there not necessarily to be retribution, but for there to be an acknowledgement of responsibility, of guilt, and then to move forward. There is a temptation to move down the path of retributive justice, but in such a small society as Armenia, to go down that path can be dangerous, and that's a reason why the KGB files were not opened up after independence, because then that would have torn society apart. Everybody would know your neighbor had, and this and that. So I think this is a process that needs to happen, but some very careful thought needs to be given. In most transitional justice processes, it's the state that acts with the support of civil society, because the state has the levers of justice. So I think if society is going to move forward, there needs to be a conversation about the pathways, restorative or retributive, and about what would best serve Armenia's future going forward. It's not just about, the cheap thrill of putting someone in prison because you think he's guilty. But I think leaving the events of March 1st unanswered is also not correct, because that has left its mark on Armenia.
Any more questions from the audience? At the back.
Thank you very much. My question is regarding the involvement of diaspora and these upcoming events and changes that we are foreseeing. So, as you may know, the new Minister of Diaspora suggested, for example, to make a bicameral parliament. And it caused kind of controversy in society, and there is a widespread of opinions. So I wanted to ask you if you see any effective model of diasporas participating into the not only social life, but the state regulation in Armenia. And do you agree with Minister's opinion? Thank you.
My brief comment on that is that, in my personal view, I'm very concerned about someone sitting outside Armenia in the diaspora, wherever that may be, and trying to influence events in Armenia, political or otherwise. So in a way, the political engagement should be on the local level. It should be, yes, if diasporans move to Armenia and live there and build their lives there, they could engage in the political process. But I don't know how it works that you have, some kind of a Senate or some kind of a body within the parliamentary system where people who are not living in Armenia have a say in that will affect the everyday life of Armenians. So I find it a little problematic, the idea. There might be, I don't know, some people might have a better idea or they might have thought about it, but I haven't seen anything that would convince me that it's a good idea. I think definitely, I'm not saying that the diaspora should not be engaged politically, because that's a different thing. Of course, in Armenia, sometimes they've asked me, how could diasporans live outside and criticize Armenia? Of course, people sitting in London, they criticize, Saudi Arabia or human rights in so many other countries. It doesn't mean they don't have the right or they cannot lobby towards these issues. But that's different from taking part in the parliamentary electoral system in the country.
Thank you very much. I first of all wanted to express my delight at the discussion tonight. It is so informative and rewarding, and thank you, panel, for very provocative and thought-provoking ideas. May I open up yet another uncomfortable subject, which is gathering storm in Armenia, and that is the problem, not to say the shocking revelations about the Armenian church. In other words, the corrupt regime has piled up so many terrifying socio-political problems that the church is finally coming into the fore. And the Catholicos of Echmiadzin has been unraveled to literally have 3 wives, many children, and etc. I mean, even my own expression about it is so shocking. I wouldn't like to embarrass anyone, but I wanted to know whether, I wanted to know your own views about this. Thank you very much.
Don't all answer at once.
I don't have any information or any proof or any indication to make any comment about this. What I could say is that over the last years, the church as an institution has declined. In what sense? Not institutionally, but in terms of its engagement with the Armenian person, whether in Armenia or in the diaspora. And since the church is not, the hierarchy is not elected by popular vote as such. Of course, it's elected through delegates and so on and so forth, but that's also, it has its own problems. So the church is not a state as such. So it is closed in many ways. It is not transparent in many ways. So what happens is when people are unhappy with what is going on with an institution or an organization, they tend to leave. So the membership goes down, or the engagement with the institution, in this case in the church, is problematic, or has been problematic, both in Armenia and in the diaspora. So as such, obviously, this revolution has also been a wake-up call for the church and the hierarchy to reevaluate in terms of the role of the church has in the life of the Armenian nation. And this is something that needs to be decided.
Thanks. Just to put it into a slightly wider context, not simply focusing on the church, although I think that was an important question, is that what we are witnessing today is a shift in cultural attitudes, and the attitude of the culture of impunity, of we can do whatever we want, no one is ever going to call us to account, is being called into question. And part of this is also this culture, new culture of responsibility, not the neoliberal sense of narrow individual responsibility, but a responsibility for the society, for the well-being of society. And I think this is very important to kind of shift this mentality going forward. And you know, the Armenian phrase, "Մենք ենք տերը մեր երկրի," we are the owners of our country, I think is an incredibly important thing, because it indicates a big shift in terms of thinking of, you know, how we relate to society.
I just want to add, I don't know whether the Catholicos has wives or not is a concern of the government. It may be the concern of the members of the church. But I think there is one important sense in the role of the government and education that I have to talk about. Armenia has had basically 3 constitutions since 1995. And in every single one of them, the role of the Armenian Apostolic Church has been strengthened. To the extent that I, as a born Armenian Apostolic, I think that's too much. And the Armenian Apostolic Church should compete on a level playing field with the other. It has the advantage of numbers, which is no mean feat. So one of the other things is that the church was very much hand in glove with the socially conservative agenda of the Republican Party. And even when we look at the most recent Armenian history textbooks that I have gone through and I've criticized, and I have received very mixed reviews in Armenia, very positive and very negative for what I've said, is that they tend to also very much stifle debate on the role of church or spirituality in general, or faith in the Armenian community. In one of his first interviews, the new Minister of the Education was asked about the whole subject of a history of Armenian church, which is nothing but a religion. That's the name, but essentially it's a religion course which is taught over a number of years in middle school, I think in primary and middle school. And he said, I know it's a problem, but it's not a very immediate priority for the next 1 or 2 or 3 months, but it should be tackled. So it really depends who wins after the next elections, what kind of government we have, and if this group of people stay in power, in alliance with other like-minded people, we should expect changes. For me, it will be very welcome changes. But on the other hand, I have to realize that Armenians overall are a conservative people, with a small c. I know I've lived here. So in that sense, maybe what Haraç, Armenia, and myself think is not the mainstream of what the Armenian nation thinks. And in democracy, basically numbers count, yeah? Not your degrees or the other things. So in that sense, I really don't know. I'm very much looking forward to having a more liberal approach to studying the role of the church in history and in society, which was missing in the past few years.
And just to add on this point, that the minister mentioned that Armenia is a secular state and there is separation of church and state. So obviously he was indicating at least change of policy or view on this issue. But what's interesting that even though the state is supposed to be secular, but this conservatism has come to defend or the religious and the conservatism of the political establishment have been congruent. So as a result, it has affected the secularism or the secularist view of the state itself, because conservatism and the church's view of society have kind of been intertwined. And this has been creating a problem because, again, like the contradiction of having a revolution and then constitutionality, trying to have a constitutional revolution in a way, or a revolution that fits or abides by constitutional rules. So we have a secular or a separate church and state is separate, but on the other hand, the church has this major influence within the legal system.
So thank you very much for the interesting presentation, and thanks for creating this opportunity of this very useful and interesting discussions. My question is not as uncomfortable. It's more about the economics and economy. So the fact that this revolution took place so quickly and without bloodshed is a huge delight for all of us. It has created hopes. It has given rise to hope, especially in diaspora, but also, I'd say, wider. Now, we living in the diaspora are very delighted, I'd say, young people also, not only the young people, to help somehow. And the next steps, I think, in the policy will be very important to not disappoint the hopes of the people living in Armenia and outside, and especially economic development and prosperity are quite important, I think. So in that regard, I was wondering whether there is any you have any thoughts about what the government can do in terms of, for example, creating a favorable tax regime to attract foreign direct investments, to make Armenia a hub for example, IT services. But because Armenia is relatively small and there isn't really that much human capital, is there any specific niche that you think we should focus on? Because we can't attract the whole world's demand. We need to be able to respond to that demand. So your thoughts would be appreciated. Thank you.
I'd like to just add to that question. More to do with like economic ideology. So like in the post-Soviet space, the politics in economics isn't, or hasn't, been usually discussed in the terms of left and right, which is the case in sort of Western Europe and North America. So most sort of economic discussions have been about ad hoc policies, how we can solve this specific issue, that specific issue. There hasn't been a sort of prevalent economic ideology guiding these economic policies. So I want to also sort of add to the more specific elements of economic policy to the more broader economic ideology that may be sort of injected into Armenia. As we all know, a lot of people are talking about the economist Daron Acemoglu being invited to Armenia, and I'm sure the palace know of his works and what he thinks about nation building and successful economic model, political model. So if you can sort of tie in these questions together, I'd like to open up the floor now to the panelists.
I'll start from where you stopped in terms of Acemoglu. I think in one of the ideas that he proposes in his book that with James Robinson that I quite like is this idea between inclusive versus extractive, approaches. And I think here, it's about the economy, but it's also about governance and politics. So I've already touched upon that, and I think that's something, it's about shifting the way that the state behaves and what approaches it takes. In terms of ideology, I think it would be naive to claim that after 28 years we're going to, all of a sudden see a shift away from neoliberalism in Armenia. I don't think that is necessarily going to happen. I think we may end up with a more hybrid regime rather than entirely neoliberal or entirely kind of more social democratic or socialist. I don't think we're going to go socialist. Let me correct that, take that back. But I think there will need to be more involvement of the state vis-a-vis social protection, social welfare than has been in the past 28 years. So I'm not saying entirely going back to a social welfare model, but I think the government does recognize that there needs to be some investment. Now, how do you fund this is the big question, isn't it? Now, obviously, I think, again, it's a numbers game. We have to recognize we're not dealing with 1 billion people, 100 millions of people, tens of millions of people. We are dealing with 3 million. So that, in and of itself, is not an insurmountable problem. And I think, and I have said this before, it has not been an issue of lack of resources. It has been an issue of lack of interest and lack of political will. And I think the government is already focusing on different areas, including tax collection, of how taxes are collected, thinking around I wouldn't say progressive taxation policies, but thinking around how tax collection can be improved. There has been some discussion about retrieving some of the funds that have been spirited away in offshore accounts. That is not going to be easy by any stretch of the imagination, but you know, tax justice campaigners in London have shown, estimated, shall I say, that between 21 to 35 trillion, I don't even know how many zeros that is right now, is hidden away in offshore accounts across, you know, from different countries. And that's basically taking the money that could be spent on hospitals, on roads, on schools, and being squirreled away for no one's benefit except those few. But I also think, you know, more looking forward about investment. The IT sector is obviously one. I think tourism, we need to be very realistic about, you know, promoting tourism. I think it's a great idea, but you can't have both tourism and mining in a country. If you want people to go to Jermuk, you cannot destroy the environment around Jermuk and expect people to come. I think there needs to be incentives, and I said, you know, I think there needs to be rule of law where people feel that their investments are protected. So IT sector is one, but I also talked about, you know, modern banking sector, financial sector. This is not necessarily going to, you know, take up. You don't need huge amounts of territory. You need human capital, and I think that's one thing that Armenia has and will have is human capital.
Okay.
Yeah.
One question there.
Yeah, I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts about how you move from a kleptocracy to one where there is rule of law. You've highlighted that we're not going to get any investment if we don't have the rule of law. Pashinyan, I believe, has said he's not going to interfere with the judges, but the judges were a creation of the previous system. So what can we learn from other countries, and what might the process be?
In order to speed things up, we don't have too much time. Can we take another question as well, please?
As you mentioned earlier, Ms. Ishkanyan, yeah, sorry, about foreign policy. Mr. Pashinyan was saying that actually there won't be any kind of major or considerable shift in his foreign policy. But we know that when events were unfolding in Yerevan, there were some concerns in Russia that Armenia could be going down the same path as Georgia or Ukraine, and joining to a kind of so-called anti-Russian camp of the ex-Soviets, if you might say. So what do you think was going to happen? What kind of approach is going Mr. Pashinyan to adapt or implement towards Russia?
Do you want me to? Okay. To address the last question and then go to Martin's question, I think Prime Minister Pashinyan has been very clear on this issue that his foreign policy isn't going to shift, particularly vis-a-vis Russia and all of the other partners, including the European Union and the US. So I think in that sense, and given that Russia was the first country to congratulate Armenia and to congratulate, Prime Minister Pashinyan's election was an indication that those issues are not necessarily the same as they were in Ukraine or in Georgia. So that's been my impression, that this was very much an issue of domestic politics, internal issues. In terms of the question about how do you move from a kleptocracy to a rule of law, I think that's a very important question, and I think this goes back to the question that was raised earlier about transitional justice or justice in general. And I think what there needs to be is that you cannot just say, I'm going to punish people for corruption. People need to lose their jobs. They need to be punished for corruption. There needs to be sanctions, you know, for transgressing those things, to recognize. And I think, you know, it's also around the issue of the political prisoners. If he begins to kind of intervene in the justice system and politicize the way the justice system is operating, it is a very slippery slope. And so I think, setting, he said, there needs to be, this is the way things are going to move forward. There needs to be rule of law, and it needs to operate not just in one domain, it needs to operate in lots of different domains. So questioning the monopolies, looking at corruption in the schools, corruptions within the justice system. So I think that's the way you can move from a kleptocracy, but it isn't going to happen overnight because we have very entrenched power structures that are not incentivized to change.
And also it's important, the public engagement in making of the laws, because normally Parliament passes laws or even the constitutional change. I don't think there was serious public debate in a meaningful sense where people could engage and contribute to a meaningful discussion. And in fact, even today, a lot of times they're reading the Constitution for the first time and finding out that, oh, there is something that wasn't thought about. How do we get out of this situation? Even those who, if you remember, with the election of the president, Serzh Sargsyan, there was this whole question about whether the new constitution will be in effect before or after his appointment or election. So there are a lot of shortcomings, even in the constitution that was passed, that have created sort of problems, such as, for instance, at the moment, there is no process to dissolve the parliament. Neither the Prime Minister nor the President can resolve the parliament. So you're stuck with a situation. So I think the public engagement is very important. And as important is also the public discourse in terms of what Armenia should be, in terms of the population's vision. It's not just one political party or one leader deciding the future, but also engaging the various segments in society as to where we want to go. And obviously this is a legacy, this problem is a legacy from the Soviet times, because the party decided everything. So there was as if this inbuilt mentality that someone there in the government or in the party will take care of things we don't need to worry about. But as we saw in the revolution, now you have a new generation, the so-called independence generation, that doesn't have the baggage of the past, and I'm sure that they will have an enormous impact on how things are going to move from this point. And some indication of that is the new cabinet, because you have a lot of young people and a lot of new ideas, and also inexperience, which sometimes is good, because if you come with too much experience, then you're bringing certain baggage with you into the job.
But you also have one of the best picks as a Minister of Justice, a person with a long experience, in defending the rights of those who were being persecuted by the previous regime. I was asked about what the new government should do before Serzh Sargsyan by somebody who I think was asking information. And I said the earliest way to assure the people that you will change something is to hit at the judiciary. I'm a bit revolutionary in this. The judicial system has been accomplice in having this system imposed and giving it a legal cloak, starting from the Constitutional Court to the judges, etc. So we have two types of judges who should ultimately be dismissed. One, those who implemented political decisions and sent these political prisoners to jail. Secondly, the corrupt ones. And we know, and the human rights defender a few years ago came up with a list. He said, these are how much people have to pay for degrees. This was a government office, and basically he was forced to go out. He was saying, how much does it cost to get a verdict with dirhams, how many thousands of dirhams, etc. And there is the third, so people know who are the corrupt judges. It's no secret. I don't know the names, but I'm sure all the lawyers know. We know the names of those political judges because we already see those trials covered on TV. And the third issue is the large number of defeats Armenia suffers in the European Court of Human Rights. Overall, I've heard lawyers say at least the government is changing the legislation that they're proposing, which is good. But at the same time, never one judge asked, why did you pass this verdict, which cost the government so much, so that that judge should defend his or her decision. Otherwise, maybe he or she should have been punished for being negligent. In most cases, we think that they were not negligent, they were just executing orders from the top. So opening up these issues are very important because it's the easiest and the least costly part of the government system to put the courts in the hands of people that the overall population trusts them. And that will open the way for investment protection and all the other things. It's the most crucial, and I'm glad that at least in this case, we cannot question the age, we cannot question the experience of the new Minister of Justice, and I'm really hoping that he will do as good a job as minister as he was as a lawyer and then a deputy.
Thank you. We'll have just one more question.
Hi. You mentioned already, Ms. Ishranyan, about the large-scale corruption in the country and sort of the methods in which that can be alleviated. But sort of my question is tailored towards the smaller petty corruption, which, as you mentioned earlier, the 1,000 dirham, the 5,000 dirham that you can just put in the passport and give to the police officer. Obviously, we take we sort of take advantage of the fact that over the last 30, 40 years, we've developed processes in this country to alleviate that, but those processes haven't yet been put into place. On paper it works, but not in practice in Armenia. So what do you feel would be the best optimum solution to eradicating the petty corruption in the country?
We'll take one more question, but please let's have some quick answers.
I'll start answering that, and then do you want to?
Let's take both and just we'll finish there.
Thank you. Anais Valentine, and I'll try to be very quick. So for someone observing from the outside, and so for someone maybe less emotionally invested into all the processes there, it does seem that there is a lot is revolving around one person, a personality, which is great. There's a lot of adoration of the person. And to be fair, it was really necessary to have that leader at the very beginning to make the people believe that the change could happen. Now that the person is on the execution side, he probably is going to have to make some tough decisions for the good of the country. Some unpopular decisions, which could turn the people who just adore him against him. So I was just wondering if you thought there was any risk in that, and if you think you do, is there anything that can be done to mitigate that risk and sort of embed his positiveness, his responsiveness into the system, so that when you take the person out of the system, the whole thing doesn't fall apart?
Should I start? Okay, I'll be quick. First of all, that's a good question. Let's ask why petty corruption happens. I think there's two reasons. One is because it helps grease the wheels of bureaucracy, makes things happen. Another reason is the people sometimes taking the bribes don't get paid enough in their jobs, so that's an additional income, which then they feed back up the pyramid. And then another reason is maybe the people who give the bribes, you know, just don't want to, for instance, deal with the traffic violation. So it's, you know, getting rid of a problem without thinking about the wider. So I think if you can pinpoint the causes, then you can think about policy solutions. Pay your teachers a better wage, and they won't have to take bribes from the parents. Pay the policemen a living wage, you know, fair wages. So I think there are these issues. So that's where I would begin, trying to diagnose the problem before the cure. In terms of the second question, I think is an excellent question about, you know, we don't want to fall into another cult of personality, and there is a huge danger of that. And I think because the struggle itself in the past month was decentralized, that showed that there are different ways of leading. It doesn't have to always be centralized. But I think what we need to move away from is person-centric governance towards more institutional. We need to build up infrastructure. We need to think about structures that can survive after Nikol. It's not about just him. He played a key role, not to discount from that, but it can't just be about one person. Quick, was that good?
I think I want to add to this because it's a very important question, not only in terms of states, but even in companies. As they say that when you become the CEO of a company, you have to think about your successor immediately on the day you become the CEO. Because if that's not part of your leadership, then you are eventually going to create your own problems for yourself and the corporation. So any leader, whether Pashinyan or else in Armenia, who doesn't think about, in the process of leading the country, about the next leadership who will be replacing them, then they might fall into the trap of becoming too kind of comfortable in their seats.
Well, let me just finish with a symbolic story from recent medieval Armenian history. According to Serzh Sargsyan, the mythical Armenian king Vagarshag, when he became king, he appointed two people in his court, one to always remind him of his good deeds, and the other one to always remind him of his bad deeds. So technically, and going back, I think presidents or prime ministers in Armenia can tend to cut off from the public. And we saw that with Serzh Sargsyan in his last ever appearance. So it is very important for Nikol Pashinyan to have people who will bravely tell in his face what the situation in the country is. Obviously, every leader loses ratings over time, yeah? And so he will not be different. He should know when to exit so that people will respect him for what he did. Whether that will be in 2, 4, 5, or 6 years, I don't know, but certainly, hopefully not 10 or 15 years. So that's a very, very important thing. And I really don't know his wife, but since she is a newspaper editor, I think she can be the best person to tell him what the people think about him without fearing to lose her job. And in that sense, she has an advantage of having a very educated and active partner next to him, and let's use that to Armenia's advantage.
And on that note, with the specter of Movses Khorenatsi hovering over us, I would like to thank the panelists, Dr. Armine Ishkhanyan, Dr. Harash Chilingiryan, and Dr. Aras Sanjan. Please give a round of applause. I don't think I actually introduced myself. My name is Leon Aslanov, and this event was organized by the Programme of Armenian Studies. Please follow Programme of Armenian Studies on Facebook and join the emailing list so you can follow our events in the future, which we usually organize in London and sometimes across Europe. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you to all those watching from home online. Thank you very much.
Thank you.